Well, welcome to our latest edition of Rethinking Trauma and Transition, and we are delighted today to have Jane Griffiths, who's the driving force behind CAPA First Response.
Welcome, Jane. Thank you so much for giving us your time today.
Thank you for inviting me.
So we wondered, first off, if you'd like to give an overview of CAPA First Response to our listeners so that they've got an understanding of what your organisation does, who you support.
So CAPA First Response is a sort of remote organisation. So we work with families and professionals, but really there we're to support families where they are impacted by a child who uses harmful and or aggressive behaviour towards them as parents or caregivers. And I set up CAPA, we're coming up to 3 years old, although we would have been going for 4 years because for a year, it was sort of a bit of a pipe dream. We were kind of putting it all into place, really. And we register ourselves as a community interest company, which means we're not for profit in 2020. So we offer free advice and support to families. We deliver training to professionals, and we do sort of podcasts like this, really, where we raise awareness. You know, the children and young people who use aggressive or harmful behaviours in the home, sometimes referred to as violence and abuse towards a parent, is something that's certainly on the rise. Families are paying more attention to it and are prepared to sort of talk about it more, and professionals are noticing it much more in their work.
What support would that look like to somebody who comes to your organisation?
So I really wanted it to be where anybody could access us at CAPA. I didn't want it that you had to be involved with a professional or you had to live in a certain postcode to get our support. So anybody, whether you're working with a professional or not, can simply email us and let us know that they want our support. It's as simple as that. We will then respond and ask them to fill out a form, which tells us a little bit more about what's happening. They send that back to us, and then we will be back in contact with them to make an appointment. And the support we normally offer is we generally suggest we have something called advice and support sessions, which are 30 minutes. And we have up to 3 to 5 of those on average. So that's a couple of hours worth of support. And generally that's enough for a lot of families to look at reducing the behaviour.
I suppose what interested us, Jane, in terms of the conversation we're having today, is that given the nature of our podcast, Rich and I talk about that, the trauma impact and the related behaviours and experiences that sit behind that a lot. And that means that, for instance, we've covered things like adverse childhood experiences. We've had conversations about what a trauma response actually looks like. And we've also had a lot of conversations about, I suppose, how we communicate and what our behaviours and intentions and expressions sometimes actually relate to, because it's not always obvious. And I know that sometimes gets quite muddled when we don't have the maturity or the experience maybe to translate our thoughts and emotions, etc. And I suppose where I'm coming from is a twofold piece of how did CAPA come about in the first place? And also how does that relate in terms of that expression piece, that communication piece? I think it's a lot more complicated than just about simple acts of aggression. I think there's a huge amount under there.
It is. And I think that's a really, important thing for us to highlight, really, when we're talking about this, because often when we talk of the issue of a child who uses aggression or harmful behaviours in the home, and what I mean by that is threats to parents, threats to siblings, threats to pets. It could be destroying property. It could be the physical act of being hit, spat at, scratched, bitten. It could be verbal name calling, intimidation. We're talking about a whole raft of behaviours. And often it's the behaviour that we focus on. It's the what is happening. It's my child is hitting, screaming, shouting, throwing, destroying things. It's the what. And what I talk to parents about all the time really is, if we can't change those what's if we don't understand why it's happening. So it's looking underneath. Why is your child, or why is a child behaving this way? What's this child trying to tell us? What are they trying to communicate to us? Because 99.9% of the time is always about the why. Always. So you're absolutely right. Thinking about, why is a child hitting me? Why is a child screaming and shouting and yelling at me? And there's a bit of a myth that it's a bit about a belligerent child who doesn't have enough discipline, who needs a clip around the ear, who needs to go, join the military. That's what we did. That put them back into shape. There's a lot of myths that need to be debusted, if you like, around this issue, because it's not a belligerent child.
There's the old adage, Jane, isn't there, of it's never done me any harm, of having a bit of a spanking or a clip around the ear, however it may manifest.
Yeah, and sadly, we do hear that quite a lot around physical discipline being the answer to this issue. But what physical discipline does, it instills fear. I remember, I'm a child of the 80s, and I remember the first time I got spanked for swearing. And I remember how angry that made me feel, and how upset and how unfair it felt. And I went into school the next day and I hit one of my friends. And that was a complete, link to myself being hit. It didn't make me think about not doing it again. It didn't make me think about how I would change what happened. It just made me really angry. So I'm not entirely sure, that any of that kind of physical discipline is based around creating fear for a child. It's not creating an understanding of why the behavior is happening. And I think that's the bit that it's very hard as a parent to step back a moment when potentially for some parents and carers, you've been attacked violently or verbally by your child for 10 years plus. To step back and ask that parent to say, hold on a second, let's look at why this is happening, and let's see if we can think about a compassionate and empathic approach to changing this. Because often parents will say, I've had enough, I can't do this anymore. I can't wait for them to leave. I've had enough. Literally got in contact with a parent yesterday whose child is about to go into care because she cannot cope with the child's behaviour anymore.
Yeah, because on our previous chat, Jane, you mentioned that you used to see people, adolescents around, say, 13 to 15 years old was like the common group, didn't you? And now it's gone down to, 3-4 years old because of lockdown and that lack of social interaction kind of thing?
I've been working with familiar violence for 20 plus years, but I've been working specifically with this area of a child who uses these behaviours in the home for probably about 13 years now. And what I've noticed in those 13 years that I've been working in the field, there's been a real change in the demographic, or a real change in families, I think, prepared to come forward. I'm not suggesting that it was never there earlier, but certainly more prepared to notice it and seek support. So when I first started, I would say 75% of the families that were referred to us for intervention was families where domestic abuse was the primary issue happening in the home. And it was teenage boys towards single mums. Now, fast forward 13 years, and that demographic has changed massively. It's very much more what we're seeing as a neurodiverse diagnosis, whether that's a formal diagnosis or informal. There's certainly an increase in anxiety, and we're certainly seeing families coming to us where children, literally at a referral, like say for a professional referring a child that was 2 to our services and 3. It's not to say that those issues weren't there, because I think what's fair to say is a lot of parents have said, I wish I'd seen this earlier. I wish I knew about this earlier. My child is 15, 16 now, but actually I noticed that, this has been happening since they were 5 or 6. I think it's actually sort of noticing it and knowing that there's organizations out there and talking to people about it and listening to to conversations like this. It alerts parents that actually, okay, this is an issue. It's not just me. It's not just happening in my family. And there is support to it.
It strikes me, I mean, before we started recording, we were having a conversation about communication and how communication happens, and the fact that sometimes the outward expression of that communication isn't the intention of the communication. And as I was listening to you, there was a phrase that I was recalling, which is, you cannot not respond. Now that takes a wee while to wrap your head around, but it's as simple as, and I made a choice recently to block somebody from my social circle. And you would argue that I had not responded, but actually I have, because my action is my response. I have communicated something to them in that response. It just might mean that that response has been different to what they would anticipate. If you overlay that, you cannot not respond, and also the fact that sometimes how we communicate something or express a need for a communication of something can be multiple and varied, and it doesn't always match intention, then what we get to is a point where, as you're saying, what is being said in those actions, or what need is being expressed, even if that is badly expressed, or rather, I'm going to change that to poorly expressed, in that the expression doesn't match the intention or the need, but it's an expression of something.
You know, I purposely set the organisation so we would work with young people up until the age of 25. And that was a purposeful setting of that age, because that's when the teenage brain stops developing. So previous to that, we could argue that actually being able to have the ability to communicate effectively comes to us much later. So as an adult, if I've had a pretty rubbish day at work, or I've really struggled with something, I'd like to think as an adult, I could probably express that, whether it's to my mates, my partner, or to somebody. But if you're a 5-year-old or a 10-year-old or a 12-year-old or a 15-year-old, you often don't have the language to express what you're feeling. And for many parents and many young people that we work with, they don't actually know why they feel annoyed or frustrated. For sometimes they can't connect the behavior to the feeling. And part of what we do is help that happen and help explore what that looks like. But when you've got, let's give an example of, you know, an 11-year-old who is really angry, comes home from school, is a perfect student at school, has good friends, gets on well with all the subjects. The school have no reason to sort of contact the parents to say they have any concerns around the student. Fast forward to the student getting home, coming home, not having any relationship with a parent, not wanting to even particularly speak to them. Any conversations they have with them are shouting, swearing, name calling, being, you know, taking themselves up to their bedrooms, isolating themselves. What is the intention behind that behavior? What's going on for that young person? Is it because maybe they're masking at school, which is a common phrase now, isn't it? There's a lot of masking that happens. So a child is like sitting at school saying, everything's okay, everything's okay, everything's okay, where actually they're really struggling with something, and they come home and explode. So the intent behind the behavior, as you say, is what is it somebody's trying to communicate? Working with an 8-year-old who really struggled to go to school every day, told her parents she was really struggling to go to school every day, told the school she was struggling to go to school every day. The message from the school is, we need you in school. We need you to be here. So she really struggled. And it escalated one day when mum took her into school, and she sort of took herself away from mum and climbed the school fence. It was an 8-foot fence. And the school advised mum, go, we'll deal with it. She's here in school now, we'll deal with it. That was a very clear message by that 8-year-old that she was struggling. And I'm not blaming the parents or the school, but people aren't listening to what our children are trying to tell us. And what we do with parents, what we work with parents is, why was she climbing the fence? Why is it a struggle at school? Why was she fighting and screaming every time you tried to put her coat on to go to school or put her shoes on to go to school? Or it was time to brush your teeth or time to get out of bed? What's the why behind the screaming and the shouting and the behaviour?
It's a bit like taking the assumption that, this is a phrase I hate, oh, I have a difficult child. And what is, I suppose it's about rephrasing that, isn't it, to say, what do you not have the vocabulary or the experience to express to me in any other way that I need to find a way for you to communicate?
I think that goes hand in hand, Ali, excuse me, with how effectively, as an adult, am I communicating as well?
Yeah.
And how effectively do I pass on my communication skills to my child?
Yeah.
So if we're not able to communicate effectively as an adult, that child isn't going to be able to effectively communicate. But a lot of people think they can and think they are good at communication when we're not. So it starts with those, as you mentioned, Jane, those listening skills, really sitting down, being present with whomever it is you're talking to, and finding out what they're after, what the problem is, what their issues are.
Yeah, it's really interesting. Sorry, it was really interesting that you said that, Ali, about, labels. Labels are massively, important in this area, and when we're thinking about families who are impacted by this. I was in the local shop recently, and there was a grandparent showing off her granddaughter. She literally got 1 foot and somebody would stop her and say, oh my God, she's so sweet, she's so adorable. She was less than 3 months old. She was little, teeny tiny. And how the grandmother was describing this tiny child was, she's so good. She sleeps through the night. She's so good for her mum. And I just found it interesting, the messages we give of the good child or the difficult child, the labels we give our children. Children live up to labels. If they're the difficult child, if they're the clumsy child, if they're the shouty child, they'll live up to those labels. So terminology and communication is really, really vital. And one of the first things we do with families is think about, what is the communication? I mean, we consider this issue to be a relationship fracture and a communication breakdown. So somewhere along the line, the relationship has fractured, and a child, for some reason, has not been able to trust what the parent is telling them. And for that, there's lots of different reasons why that happens. It can be through parental conflict. It can be through grief. It can be through loss. It can be through a frustration around a neurodiversity. It can be through mental health, substance misuse, divorce, domestic abuse. There's a whole gamut of whys this behavior can happen. But somewhere in there, the relationship has just fractured. And what needs to happen, and a lot of the work we do, is around rebuilding that attachment and that trust. And we do that through communication and modeling what we want you to do. For some of the parents, we ask them to do things that actually they're really uncomfortable doing because they've never actually sat down and played with their child, or they've never sat and had that conversation where it's collaborative. Not because they haven't wanted to, it's just not part of what they do. They're just getting on with parenting. So it's actually trying to break things down and think about, how do we communicate? What does our communication tell us? How do we say something? What's the tone of our voice saying? What's my body language looking like when I'm asking my child to get up in the morning? So communication and attachment building, it's all of our work is focused around those areas, because that's what we're trying to achieve.
I'm going to bring something into the topic, Rich, which is fermented garlic honey.
Mm-hmm.
And it sounds a bit random, but Rich planted the idea of fermented garlic honey with me, about 6 months ago? Thereabouts?
Oh, this time last year.
Was it this time last year?
So,
and my initial response, there is a point to this, by the way, my initial response was, that's absolutely manky. I can't even wrap my head around that. And there was a part where I was kind of like, no, that's just such a big no. It's unbelievable. However, over the next period of about 3 or 4 days, I found myself, I'd be standing in my kitchen going, actually, I can make a really good salad dressing with that. That would be really tasty. Or, that would be a really good marinade. Or I could do this with that or that with that. And over the course of 4 days, because I'd given, I suppose, space to step away from the initial concept, my initial knee-jerk reaction to the idea of fermented garlic honey, I now was able to place that somewhere and go, actually, do you know what? I'm on board with that idea now. And my response totally changed to that concept because I had time to, in a way, circle round it a few times to see where it fit and how that could be of use. Because sometimes our initial response, it's almost like that point of my, like I said, my bit of my mental breakdown when you said fermented garlic honey, and they just didn't match. I couldn't make the bits put together.
Yeah.
Give me some time to process it, it starts to fit.
Well, as a friend of ours says, isn't Ali, is if you're thinking about doing something, give it 24 hours before you actually go ahead and do it.
Yeah. Mm-hmm.
I love the idea of fermented garlic honey.
It's really good for colds and stuff.
I'm on board. But it goes back to, it goes back to what we were speaking about, how we get focused on the what. And the thought of looking behind the what is something, oh, hold on a second, but I'm supposed to be trying to stopping my child. I want them to come in at 10 o'clock when we've asked them to. I want them to come off a tablet when I've asked them to. I want them to go to school because they need to. I want them to stop swearing at me. We're focusing on what is happening. And what we look to do is refocus the what to the why. And sometimes, exactly like you say, sometimes a parent needs to go away, which is why when we do an advice and support session, we do that first half hour and then say, we'll see you next week. Mm-hmm. Because it gives you that time to step back and think, I wonder what that why is about. Let me think about that. Actually, you know what? You're right. There is that why. How can I address that? Right. Second session, let's look at what those changes are that we can put into place because you've had that thinking time. Mm-hmm. Because so many people who want to support families doing this will focus on changing the what, and that can actually escalate things because they'll ask you to put in punitive measures, as we call them. So if your child doesn't come in at 10 o'clock, like you say, you've got to call the police, or you've got to tell them they can't go out the next day, or you've got to ground them, or you've got to take a tablet away, or you've got to take a phone away. You've got to give them a consequence. And that actually, again, I go back to that analogy. If you've had a crappy day at work and you come home and you want to tell somebody that you've had a crappy day and they ignore you. So you're like, oh, this is really frustrating. And actually they take your phone away from you because you've expressed something. We want families to be able to express things in a healthy, positive way. And as families, we all have arguments. But it's about doing that in a healthy, positive way without having to punish somebody for not telling you how they feel in the most appropriate way. So, for example, just quickly to go back to that young person who was climbing the fence, what I advised the mum to do was when she picked her up from school was to say, thank you so much for showing me how you felt today. I don't think I wanted you to climb a fence because that's not so safe. But thank you for showing me that something was wrong. So you're trying to get that balance right.
Well, I'm just conscious that quite often when I'm working with clients, and I think, Rich, you're exactly the same as well, is that when we're working with trauma responses, sometimes the knack to reducing those or resolving those is understanding the purpose they are serving. Because it's our system trying to tell us something. It's our brain trying to communicate something to us that we are not paying attention to in the moment, that we maybe haven't acknowledged. And that can be a range of things from I'm not taking enough care of myself, I'm not respecting my own values, I'm not respecting my own boundaries, or I'm placing myself in a situation where I'm overextended, where I'm burnt out, where I'm getting to the point of I can't sustain this. There's a whole gamut there of elements. But that's also sometimes where it's coming back to that, what actually is being communicated, because quite often if you don't have the language, if you don't have the space to allow yourself to almost find how the fermented garlic honey fits and where you place it, then actually all you end up doing is having a decision call made on the surface rather than actually what's happening underneath.
Yeah, and I think we talk to parents about how do you reconnect with compassion and empathy towards your child when actually they have been name calling, the relationship is non-existent. It's a really difficult relationship. It's really hard to kind of reconnect for parents. And there's a really lovely quote about taking small steps, and don't forget to take the small steps to change the bigger picture. Because often parents are just like, just stop it. I just want the behavior to stop. We need to change the behavior of the young person. And what we need to do is just slow the pace down a little bit, take small steps.
I think
that's if it's hard for the parent to reconnect, how difficult is it for that child to reconnect?
Well, building up trust again is really hard, isn't it?
Yeah.
When you've created we all have narratives. And when a child has created a narrative to keep themselves emotionally safe, sometimes physically safe, but emotionally safe, if you can't control what's happening in your life, then sometimes what you do is control what you can, the bits closest to you. So if you can't, another quick example, worked with a young person who from year 7, 8, and 9 was bullied. Wasn't bullied up until year 7, but year 7, as soon as went to secondary school, he was bullied in school. And at the same time, his parents divorced. 2 big things out of his control. So what could he control? Well, he could control what time he ate. He could control what time he went to bed. He could control who came into his room and who didn't. He could control who he decided he was going to hang out with and what he ate. And then he could start to control things on a wider spectrum. So he started to control what his parents would do, who they could speak to, who they couldn't. But that control kept him safe because everything around him wasn't safe. He would go into school and be mercilessly bullied. He would try to get that sorted. His parent was aware of that, but couldn't change it for him. So he became more angry at the parent for not fixing the problem. So he had to control more and more of what was happening in order to keep himself safe. And that diminishes trust between a parent and a child. So rebuilding that trust for a child and young person takes a long time. So when parents say to me, nothing's changed on a week to week, it's like, this is and actually a parent emailed me this just the other day. You reminded me that this is a lifetime work. My relationship with my child is a lifetime. It's not just the next week. So it's thinking about what are the small things we can do to rebuild trust. I might get you to do one thing with your child that you do for months, because I want you to change and build that trust consistently with your child, because then we can start changing the bigger picture. Of course, we want to keep you safe. We want to make sure that the violent part of the behavior and the emotional violence doesn't, create an unsafe environment. But we've got to start with the small steps. And unless we do that effectively, we won't change anything that happens in the home.
Some cases as well is teachers are trauma-informed, but when they're dealing with a child who has been traumatized, they're missing the context behind that child's actions as well. So for argument's sake, if a child has been assaulted at school and they've been told by one of the teachers is what you're wearing is inappropriate, and that then triggers a child because they may be bullied over the clothing that they're wearing. The child wants to get away and they're pushing away from the teacher to escape. That's that fight, freeze, but that teacher's preventing that child from leaving the classroom or that corridor, wherever it is. And thereafter, an apology, that again is get that child into a high state of arousal without any context behind what that child is doing.
Yeah, escalates that fight, flight, freeze without, and it's almost kind of like that clash of agendas there, isn't it? Where you've got one person in that agenda and communication who thinks they need to exert the authority and establish respect, and the other part which isn't being seen, which is I'm in full-blown panic mode. I need to exit this situation for my own safety. And you end up with a miscommunication in between because of the lack of attention and awareness that's paid to what's really being communicated there and the impact of actions. It's a mismatch, isn't it?
And I think that hyperarousal is happening between the parent-child relationship. So we often talk to families about the window of tolerance and how families are consistently living outside of their window of tolerance. And, being that hyper-aroused or hypo-aroused is just the norm. And so you've constantly got that fight, flight, and freeze, which is why we look at communication, which is why we look at what are the triggers. If there are triggers, how can they be connected to trauma? And how do we make sure that we don't re-trigger and reconnect?
It almost comes back to almost like subliminal unconscious labeling, doesn't it? Because in that state, the parent potentially then becomes almost hypervigilant for signs of escalation. That hypervigilance then triggers that situation where the anxious vibes in the room are through the roof. So in effect, the family starts walking on eggshells, which then escalates the hypervigilance, which puts the child that's in the centre of this on edge because they now feel judged. They now feel extra anxious because they're surrounded by anxiety. And before you know it, you've got a powder keg.
Yeah. And you've got people consistently living in hyperarousal or hypoarousal consistently. So actually recognizing that and coming away from that. And I'll give you a really quick example, shouting up the stairs to my kids, come on, guys, it's time for pizza and ice cream. What my children hear is mum shouting at them. So they go straight into hyperarousal, fight, flight, and fright. What's happening? Why is mum shouting at me? What's going on? I'm going to have to get up to that level to meet that. Because when I meet my mum, am I going to go into fight, flight, or freeze? Actually, I might not just come out of my room. I'm going to freeze. I'm just going to sit there, not come out of my room in very, easier terms. I'm going to go downstairs and I'll be up for a fight. Oh, what have I done? What have I done? Yeah. So you can see how families are consistently living in hyper or hyperarousal, which is what we consider our window of tolerance. And what I say to families is, for you to come back into your window of tolerance is going to take time because potentially you've spent years living out of it. So you're constantly looking for what's happening. And as is your child, constantly looking to respond to that, or you're responding to your child. In fact, like you say, it's that cyclical catch-21.
Well, you've also got the issue of normalization in there as well, where we normalize our responses and our experiences and our behavioural levels, so that actually when we start to instigate changes which de-escalate, then that can feel almost more anxious than the eggshells. Because now you've got a point of comparison and it makes the eggshells possibly seem even more fragile. And if you're almost in that point of change where you're moving between those two states, because that's part and parcel of that journey, really, you're not going to make that step in one full go. It's incremental, as you say, it's lots of little steps. Then that intervening period, it's almost giving yourself permission for this to feel very uncomfortable, but it's in the right direction. And recognizing what the uncomfort is a sign that something is changing positively.
And it's listening, isn't it? When you're in a relationship with somebody, particularly your child, and you've got a difficult relationship, the relationship is fractured, as we've been speaking about. Actually being able to hear what somebody's trying to say to you can get all muddied up, and you may not be able to hear what's happening. I did an assessment for a family quite a long time ago, and it was a 14-year-old girl with her mother. And this just sort of highlights where people are within their communication and how actually when you're so heightened in your relationship with your child, you just don't connect and you can't hear each other. Teenager came home from school And going back to what you were saying, Rich, about, uniform and teachers, her skirt, which is very much the norm, her skirt was hiked up and it was short. And she walked through the door, and the first thing her mother said to her was, "I cannot believe you're wearing your skirt like that. Can't believe that's how you wore your skirt." That's the first sentence that came out of her mouth when she's already not got a very good relationship with her daughter. And her daughter just turned round, called her a name, and walked up the stairs. They were not able to communicate effectively with each other. They couldn't hear each other, complete miscommunication. So one of the things, like I say, we strive to do at CAPA is bring parents and families down to a point where they can hear each other, because that's one of the first steps. And how we do that is something through validation, validating the experience that you're seeing presented before you. If your child is struggling to go to school, it's validating. I can see that's a real struggle. I wonder how I can help. I can see that you're really struggling to turn off the computer. I know we agreed 10 o'clock, but I can see you're really struggling with that. What can we do? It's paying attention to what you're seeing and validating the experience, because that helps you bring down that scale, which enables you to hear each other and communicate effectively.
Physiologically speaking as well, is when blood pressure gets to a certain point, so like 170 and above, then people will automatically have auditory exclusion, visual exclusion, tunnel vision. And so our senses are very, very limited anyway. And it's just that what we're looking at as our threat or target, what's in front of us. So if we're in a heightened state of arousal, there's no way in God's green earth that we can actually communicate effectively.
I heard a statement from somebody recently. It was Dr. Annie Clements, who said, nobody ever calmed down from being told to calm down. Yeah. When you've dysregulated, there is no point in asking somebody to calm down, because they've dysregulated, because they can't hear. It's called flipping your lid. It's that frontal cortex that's rational thought is not connected to the emotional thought. So actually it just, you can't rationalize. There's no point in sitting down and saying, so I can see you're really angry, you need to calm down. It's actually, how do you sit with that behavior safely and then have the conversations afterwards? Yeah. Well, it's safe. Oh, that was really tough. See how angry things were.
The best thing to do is to invite someone to sit down, because that then automatically starts to lower the blood pressure. And just sit with them, not necessarily saying anything. It's like, as you mentioned before, it's taking that few minutes to wait, relax, and then have that conversation before jumping in to go, what are you wearing that? What are you doing that? And start accusing people of things.
I think sometimes there's also something really powerful about giving somebody space and letting them know that you're giving them space. Yeah. So that might be a case of, I can see that there's a lot going on for you just now, that actually where you're at just now, your emotions are all over the place.
Yeah.
I want to understand why, but I also want to make sure that you're comfortable to share that when you're ready.
Yeah. And how powerful does that feel? Just hearing you say that, Ali, simply changing our communication and simply changing how we say something can just really change what somebody hears. And it's, we're sitting here talking about it in a calm, adult manner. It's difficult for parents to think, really, that's going to make a difference. It's just paying attention to it, I think, to begin with, isn't it? It's paying attention to what's happening and how can I change the why.
It is.
And validate that.
As I say to a lot of my clients I see is, it's easy for me because I'm sat behind a screen to say, how about this, how about that? It's so much easier than actually being in it. But I'd also say, you mentioned the word relationship as well, Jane. But I'd rephrase that as, how do you want to relate to your child? Do you want to relate to them as a shouty, angry parent? And do you want that child to relate to you as an angry, shouty, violent child who's in a state of distress? It's probably not a healthy way to relate to one another. But maybe reframing that as saying, I want to relate to my child in a better way, and I want my child to relate to me in a better way.
And that comes back to trying to help a parent understand it's not about the what's, because when a parent is constantly being hit and smacked around or thrown things out or not being spoken to or not coming home, how can you get a parent to say, hold on a second, I'm gonna try to think about this in a compassionate way? And I think for me, that's the key to the work we're doing and key to what we're trying to work with parents and young people and children around. It's understanding why are you doing what you're doing? And let's unpack that a little bit before we can then put those strategies in place.
I think sometimes the most powerful gift we can give someone is the gift of hearing and seeing them. And giving them the space to let them know that I see and I hear you. I might not necessarily understand what it is you're telling me right now, but I'm listening.
And I may not always get it right.
But I'll give you permission to say, no, that's not quite it, because at least we're talking now.
I mean, I have rows with my 14-year-old son, and I do turn around and say, you know what, I think I may have got that wrong. I think I may not have gotten that right. And I apologize for that. Why don't you tell me what you were trying to? Because sometimes I just want the conversation. I've got to move on. I haven't got time to think about this. Yeah, come on, I told you not to do it. But actually what I didn't stop and think about was the rationale about why he was doing it. And sometimes it's okay to sit down and say, I think I got that wrong. I wasn't really paying attention. Let's rewind and have that conversation again. And I can pay it attention. And that's okay. But sometimes we get caught up in a power battle, for a better one to put it. Well, it's my child should just listen to me regardless. Isn't that the parent-child relationship?
I think that's also sometimes about us being more deliberate in how we communicate. So I'm just reflecting, Rich, on
I'm going to interrupt Ali while she's thinking. I think it's also, in some cases, it'll be ego and I want to exert my authority.
Yeah.
So I'm reflecting, Rich, sometimes when you and I are working on something and maybe we're working remotely, so we're working over Zoom. And because there'll be slightly different elements of the piece of work that we're looking at, one of us might find something and go, oh, have you seen this? And it's almost what we've got to be very conscious about is going and expressing where we're at to say, I know you need to share this with me. Give me 30 seconds, a minute, because I don't want to give you my split attention. I want to focus entirely on that, because otherwise it's going to frustrate the hell out of you because I'm going to ask you twice. Because I'm only going to be listening with half an ear, and that means that's not going to get done, and I'm not going to hear what you're telling me. And it's about giving that acknowledgement, sharing that, and then saying, right, okay, now 100% here.
We worked with, you just reminded me of a parent and a young person that we worked with. We had a 15-year-old who was neurodivergent, and he used to go off to college. He wasn't in mainstream school, he was in college, and he went off to college, and he used to come home every day, and he wanted to talk to his mum. And mum was always in the middle of doing 100 other things, as we do. Washing, ironing, getting dinner ready. She'd already picked the other younger siblings up from school. She was running off to clubs and being the taxi driver, all the stuff that we do as parents. And every night he would try to have a conversation with her. She would kind of give him half an ear because she'd be doing something else. And usually most nights there would be violent behavior or harmful, aggressive behavior in the household. And one of the things we suggested to mum that is, he clearly wants your time. So let's try when he comes, if you know what time he comes home from college, which she did, she had a time that he came home from college, we're going to ask you to put aside 10 minutes, which I know feels like a huge amount of time, but put aside 10 minutes for when he comes home, put the kettle on, sit down and have a cup of tea with him and give him 10 minutes of your time to talk to you. Now, she tried this strategy, and the moment she tried it, the violent and aggressive behavior stopped that night and never restarted. And it took 10 minutes out of her day to sit down with her son and completely listen to him. And that's all he needed from her. He needed to be heard. There wasn't trying to rescue him. It wasn't trying to solve conversations for him. It was purely listening to him. And that she could do. And she did that, and the behavior stopped immediately and didn't restart because she could just continue. And she loved it as much as he did, because what she got from it was the stuff she didn't realize she'd get from it. She was paying attention to what he was doing. And that's not, saying, we all try to do that as parents. Like, God, where do we get the time from? But sometimes we say, if you just sit down, even if it can only be for 5 minutes, and sit down and pay attention, sometimes that is enough. And what your child needs from you. And it was lovely to get that feedback from the parent and the child saying, this really helped us. Mm-hmm. This really changed what happened in the home.
That reminds me of the drama triangle, the victim, the prosecutor, and
rescuer.
Like you, yes.
Yeah, we do that in our work all the time. We took one of them, again, some of the strategies, we have our go-to strategies that we talk to parents about all the time. And the drama triangle, which is about conflict, is definitely amongst and up there. The minute you're trying, which is why we try to say to parents, not having rules around. Rules and boundaries are very different. A rule is very different from a boundary. A boundary is there to keep us safe. A rule is something you put in place with the hopes that somebody will abide by it. So they're quite different things. But the moment you say to your child, right, you need to come off your computer at 10 o'clock. Let's hypothetical. That's a rule we're going to have. Even if you've paved the way lovely with your child, you've been the rescuer on the triangle, you said, right, I'm going to come in at 10 o'clock, maybe I'll come in a little bit before 10 o'clock. Remember, we've agreed that this is the time you're going to come off the computer. You've done all that rescue stuff. You've tried to make it as easy as possible. 10 o'clock comes around, you go upstairs to the bedroom and you walk in the room, you say, right, it's 10 o'clock, it's time to come off your device. And you're met with a barrage of F's and blinds. I was going to swear, but I realized that probably not the best thing to do, so I won't. But you can imagine what's, potentially what a parent is hearing. The moment you've come into the room and asked the child to do something they don't particularly want to do, you've become their persecutor, and they will see themselves as the victim. How dare you tell me to come off the game? I'm not ready. I haven't finished my game yet. I didn't agree on 10 o'clock. The moment that happens and your young person starts getting into that conversation, you then are on the drama triangle because you will feel the victim and your child is your persecutor. So how dare my child? Don't swear at me. We agreed this. Stop it. You're not going to talk to me like that. That's not what we agreed. And then the conflict will start. And what happens is you stay on that drama triangle. And what we advise parents to do is jump off the triangle. Recognize you're having an argument and it's not going to get you anywhere. Recognize that your child, okay, they're feeling like the victim. They feel like I'm asking them something to do, even though we agreed it. And what we often suggest to parents is just step out for 30 seconds. Say, hold on a second, I'm going to come back. Go out and think, what is it you're trying to achieve? What is it you're trying to say to your child? They don't want to come off the computer at 10 o'clock. So what we'll do is maybe go in and sit down for 5 minutes. Say, oh, this looks interesting. What are you up to? And maybe you can find a suitable time when it feels like you've landed that plane now. Why don't you turn off the computer? I can see that you're struggling with 10 o'clock and it's difficult. I'll sit here for a couple of more minutes and we'll wind it down. Obviously there's lots of different conversations we can have depending on the scenario, but it's about recognizing you're on the drama triangle, jumping off it and thinking, what's that about?
Yes, getting that win-win. Sorry. Okay,
the win-win.
Win-win, and ultimately is what's the outcome that you both want from that?
Yeah.
So obviously the parent would like that child to have a good night's sleep.
Yeah. And the child.
It's also about changing the script.
Yeah.
Because I'm just very conscious that we get into patterns and our arguments are also patterns, our conversations are patterns. And we repeat those time after time after time. And sometimes in order to get a different outcome, we have to break the pattern.
And so when I talk to parents where they say, well, that doesn't work, it's like, well, let's have a think about changing pivoting. Okay, the strategy is sound, but maybe the way it's being related needs to just pivot and change a little bit.
Well, if we always follow the script for Hamlet, the ending's always going to be the same. If we go in, rip up the script and go, let's just ad lib a rough scenario, then we're not going to end up with Hamlet, or very, very unlikely.
Yeah. If the argument is always at 10 o'clock during that transition, you have the same argument day in, day out, let's change what happens at that point. Yeah. And often it's about with parents working backwards. That's the area of conflict for some parents. And I just don't want to forget parents that say to us, well, there doesn't ever seem to be a trigger. For some parents, it's not always like that, but it's sometimes you can work backwards and say, right, I know that 10 o'clock, that transition is going to be difficult. Mm-hmm. How can we change that? What are the different conversations I can have to change that? One, I can validate. It's hard, isn't it? I certainly know. I've got teenage children that are like, all my friends are on it. Why can't I stay on it? I bet all your friends aren't on it.
Mm-hmm.
Hamlet and Juliet is what you might end up with.
Instead of Romeo and Juliet. Mm-hmm. Yeah. Uh-huh.
So I think for those parents that tell us that there doesn't seem to be a trigger, there doesn't seem to be something I can identify that's an issue. That's the parents where we think about, sometimes talk to parents about, we all have red dots on our body. Imagine you've got lots of red buttons on your body. We all have them. And imagine your child gets up in the morning and they don't really want to go to school. So one of the red buttons is being pressed. They've maybe gotten up a bit late or they've had a bit of an argument with you about going to school, but they're going to go to school, but a couple of buttons are being pressed. They get into school and their teacher gives them a hard time because their shirt's not tucked in or their skirt's, too small. A couple of red buttons being pressed. Maybe a couple of mates have been a bit whatever to them that day, or the teacher's given them a hard time about not paying attention in class. A couple of more red buttons are being pressed. They come home from school and it's pouring down with rain, so they get home and it's soaking wet and a couple of more buttons being pressed. You then may turn around and say, how was your day today? Fancy a cheese sandwich? And what you get left with, what are you talking to me about? And parents will be like, it comes out of nowhere. It doesn't come out of nowhere. It's thinking about working backwards. I wonder what's happened for that child in that day where the buttons have all been pressed and you've just happened to press the last button. Mm. And it could be something really nice that you're offering, but that's the bit that's made them spill over.
There was a study done a few years ago now, and I can't remember how many children they had in it, but these group of children, they were all taken into therapy. And during that period of time, all their behaviour changed. But after that therapy had stopped, then their behaviour went back to normal. But then they did the therapy with the parents, and that transformed the behaviour of the parents and that child. So it was looking at or maybe the parents should look at their trigger points and their trigger warnings and all that sort of stuff, what sets them off as well.
Well, I suppose if it's a conversation, there are two sides that need to change. Relationships are more than just one person, isn't it? Mm-hmm. But that's why, again, with CAPA, we work with the whole family. And that was really, really important to me because some services are only remitted to work with a parent. Mm-hmm. Some services are only remitted to work with a young person or a child. And I think for me, it's so important when you're talking about a relationship is more than just one person. Mm-hmm. It's about the dynamic of 1, 2, 3 people, whatever the relationship is about. So even if we only talk to a parent, we will be the voice of the young person. We will never not bring that young person into the conversation. So tell me what you think your child may think about that. Let's think about what's going on for your child. If I'm talking to a young person, I wonder what your mum thinks about that. Let's think about how your mum might react to that. We're constantly bringing in the whole family, and that includes siblings. It could be your neighbour, it could be your Aunt Penny up the road. Whoever it is that you're connected to as your family, we have to work with the whole family because we can't change, changing relationships. You can only change what you do for sure. You can't control how somebody else is going to react to what you say or do. But a relationship has to consider more than just you. And that's why we're very passionate about working with the whole family and making sure that we're thinking about the relationships from both sides.
So can we talk about as well, is a terminology that's used within your industry, for want of better word, Jane, and how that can, because you mentioned labeling beforehand and how labels affect people. So changing terminology that is used can aid with more effectively using labels, I think, is what I'm trying to say.
Yeah, because I think some of the current terminology has almost implied blame and impact there. I don't know what your views on that are, Jane.
Yeah, I think terminology, it's a really touchy one in the sense that not all organizations who work with families where there is a child using this behavior agree. So you've got some organizations that are very firm that this behavior is abusive and we should term it child to parent abuse, violence and abuse. I sort of stand on the other side of the fence and think that if I've got a parent who's saying to me their 4-year-old child is using a harmful behavior towards them, labeling that child as a perpetrator or abusive can be really, really damaging. So I went to a festival up in Manchester last year. Actually, I think it was earlier this year. And it was a domestic abuse festival. And we were invited to go along and talk around this what's happening for families, this harmful and aggressive behavior. And what became really, really apparent to me as I was sitting there and I was listening to the language, I was listening to intimate partner abuse and violence, which in my opinion is very different from a child who's using this behavior. It was really clear to me that we should not be sitting in a domestic abuse environment for this behavior. I think I'm not suggesting the behavior doesn't feel abusive, because many parents tell us it feels abusive. However, intent behind, as we spoke about right at the very beginning, what's the intent behind the behavior? And asking a family of a 4-year-old or a 14-year-old to go, well, we can support you, but pop down to your local domestic abuse organization because they'll support you. You're implying that the behavior is abusive and you're a victim to somebody who's perpetrating this against you. And I just don't think that's helpful, which is why we changed.
You get a very different response then in terms of solution.
You do. You do. You get very much, it's, the victim will be supported one way and the abuser will be supported in a very different way. And actually this, for me, it's about a child who, as we spoke at the very beginning, is trying to communicate something. Mm-hmm. We're trying to understand why this is happening. So we changed our terminology from children who use abusive behavior to a child who uses, it is harmful behavior, and it is often and sometimes aggressive behavior. And it will be interesting, so much has changed in the 10 years I've been working in this. Who knows where we'll be in 10 years' time? We'll have a completely different and hopefully more in-depth understanding of this because more research will be available. But for me, it's about the barriers, that feeling of going to a domestic abuse organization to get support for my child. That's very hard for parents to kind of get their head around because it's a very different relationship when it's your child.
Mm.
And the idea of having a festival about that doesn't really click.
It was a festival of practice, Rich, which was it was a celebration of everything. But somebody, equally.
To me, it's like fairgrounds and rides and all that sort of stuff. Yeah.
Yeah. But terminology and language is huge, isn't it?
It is.
It's massive.
How we term it, and we're never going to get it right for everybody.
No, of course not.
We're never going to be able to connect for everybody.
Well, that's like what you were saying is you hosted a workshop, didn't you, Jane? Is that right? When you had a presentation, you said, this is the language that I'm using.
Yeah.
And you had a whole host of people in there go, this is better than what they're doing, but we can't use that because the people at the top won't allow it to be used.
Yeah, I mean, at the moment, there is consultations happening around what is the language we should use. Mm. And the agreement is we don't agree. Mm-hmm. We're very clear we don't agree. Yeah. I can only do what I think, listening to the community of people I work with and connecting, and so many families who have said, I really struggled because I didn't want to come to an organization where it felt domestic abuse. That didn't feel right. I think of something very different when I think of domestic abuse. And I didn't want families to be put into that category. I wanted it to be more, I'm not negating how it may feel for some people, but I do not want to label a child as an abuser. I just don't do that. I can't do that, and I won't do that. I don't think it's helpful for that child, and I don't think it's helpful for a parent to think of their child in those terms.
I would agree. So, Jane, in terms of takeaways from our conversation, I know certainly I think it would be really helpful, I suppose, if you are in that situation as a parent or a caregiver, then what do you have, maybe almost like top 3 or top 5 suggestions or things to think about in terms of that? And how do they make contact with your organisation if they're looking for some support?
So I think it goes back to what we were sort of our theme throughout our conversation really is about looking behind the what is happening. If possible, take a step back. If you can't do that independently, reach out to either an organisation like us, or reach out to family and friends and think about what could be behind the behaviour and seek support. Think about how you can validate the experiences of what's happening. Not only validate it for yourself, but validate it for your child, and have a practice of validating. Validate things to your friends, validate things for your family. Become comfortable with validation, which is praising the outcome. It's acknowledging what the outcome of something is. I can see you tried really hard to do your homework. I can see you tried really hard to get to school today. Not, it's practice that with people around you. I do urge you to seek support. Talk to somebody who knows what's happening, who won't, parents say to us they feel judged. They feel blamed. So talk to, organizations. There's lots of organizations out there, but CAPA, we offer, like I say, whole family support. You can contact us via our email, which is info@capafirstresponse.org. And we will email you back with everything you need in order to have an advice and support session with us. We're actually also we're going to be piloting in January our first Parents Forum. So that's where we're going to be offering an hour evening slot with myself and our senior practitioner, Matt, where we'll be sitting talking about this. It'll be the opportunity for you to ask questions, talk a little bit about your situation. And we're going to be offering that in January. So watch out for on our website. It's free. You just simply have to register and pop along to that. Could be the first steps to say, is this for me? Is this is this what's happening? You don't have to identify yourself. You can come along as anonymous. That's absolutely fine. But, I think it's about reaching out and seeking support if you feel you can. And if not, think about, why is the behaviour happening? Just take a minute to think, why? What is my child trying to tell me? And am I paying attention?
I'm going to ask you, how many people can attend that event?
How many people can attend that? You know what, Rich? I don't know. It's so new. Mm-hmm. I reckon I think we can have it open to, I don't think that we'll have restriction in numbers.
Brilliant.
Cool.
Because we're not having because it's not a closed group, and because we won't be going into details about individuals, we will talk a little bit about what the issue is, and then we'll have questions and answers. I think we can probably be fairly generous. But, it's all about piloting it, isn't it? Let's see how many people turn up and knock on the door and want to come in. We did this recently with another organisation. We had 25 and it worked brilliantly. So let's see what happens. And what we'll do is if we get more than 25 or 35 people, then we might just put more events on to reach more people. We want to make sure it's an event that everybody feels that they can be heard. So it's balancing up being heard with numbers. So watch this space.
Excellent.
Fantastic.
And we'll drop your details within the show notes as well.
Yeah.
Thank you. And thank you for inviting me to come along and talk to you both. It's such an important issue to continue to discuss, and such an important to raise awareness of. So thank you for coming and knocking on the door and having this conversation. It's really appreciated from us.
Well, that's really thank you to Helen for putting us in touch with you, isn't it?
Yes, Helen Bonnick, who does Holes in the Wall, which is a huge, massive resource site for anything and everything to do with this area. So, do Google that, and I'm sure you can put that in your
we will,
script at the end.
And thank you so much, Jane, once again, because I know certainly Rich and I spend a huge amount of time talking about with the people we work with ourselves, in terms of our own learning, talking about actually how important communication is and how much that attention that we pay to it matters. The structure of that and how we approach it and the air we approach it makes such a difference. Such a massive difference.
It does.
Thank you. Thank you so much.